30 years ago, the first offshore wind farm, with turbines fixed to the seabed, started producing electricity. Now, we're ready for the next revolution in renewable energy, deep water, and floating wind. So, what are the advantages with floating wind? Let's start with the basics. When the blades on a turbine spin around, electrical power is generated and transported through cables to a nearby substation. From here, the power is transported to the electrical grid on land. So how much power can we generate? Well, the larger the turbine, the more power it can produce. The latest generation of turbines will be as tall as the Eiffel Tower, and a single turbine can supply electricity to approximately 10,000 households per year. But why should we use floating wind farms instead of those fixed to the seabed? For one, bottom-fixed wind farms are typically limited to water depths up to 60 meters deep, while floating wind farms can be placed anywhere. And 80% of the world's offshore wind resources are in waters deeper than 60 meters. With floating wind, we can move further from shore to harvest the best wind resources. Another advantage is that floating wind turbines are mobile, meaning that we can install the equipment quayside before towing the foundation to its offshore location. This reduces the need for costly heavy lifts at sea and decreases the risk of delays. At Aker Offshore Wind, we utilize Aker's decades of maritime and offshore experience and our expertise in deep water technologies to develop floating wind farms for a greener future. We use data and digital tools throughout the value chain to drive down costs and optimize value. We collaborate with communities and other industries to find the best ways to share the ocean, while respecting the ocean and its wildlife in the process. Our ambition is to leave the smallest environmental footprint. Now we're ready to scale up floating wind and work on wind farms with hundreds of turbines. Together with our partners, we're taking the offshore wind industry to the next level. Join the adventure.
Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Sian Lloyd-Rees. I'm the UK MD of Aker Offshore Wind, a wind developer, as I think you've just seen on that video. And I'm chairing today's session, which is around why floating wind and is floating wind the final frontier. And I've got a really great panel actually here to debate this topic and to answer some of the questions with representatives from industry, government and private sector. But before we move to actually asking the panel and having that discussion across the piece, I just wanted to share a few insights which might basically set some of the questions for us to answer as a panel. We've heard a lot at COP so far about how world leaders can and must achieve the global climate targets that have been agreed. And we know that this will require us to accelerate the introduction of renewable and sustainable energy sources, much of it driven by innovation, which in turn will be driven by the companies that are taking part in this event today. And we also know that in most of the future scenarios, offshore wind plays a significant part in the mix of clean energy for the future. And what we're also aware of is that 80% of offshore wind resource actually lies in water deeper than 60 meters, generally up to 2,000 meters water depth, so much deeper than today's fixed bottom wind structures would allow, which takes us into the realms of floating wind. And of course, the further we go offshore, the deeper water, the larger the structures, the more cables we need, the greater the distance to bring that energy back onto shore, so it all increases the cost. And the challenge that we have is, how do we manage to bring floating offshore wind to be able to deliver the benefits that it can affordably? Because if we can crack this, offshore wind has the ability to deliver 11 times more global power than the demand currently is today. So it's quite a prize to go after. And what I wanted to share was three areas, or three ways in which I think if we focus, particularly here in the UK, if we focus on offshore floating wind, we can achieve what we want to, which is affordable energy for the consumer, sustainable affordable energy for the consumer. And the three areas that I wanted to propose, firstly, is scale. I think when we talk about offshore floating wind, we need to be talking at the scale of 1, 2 gigawatts, 3 gigawatt field developments. That scale will give us the economies of scale that we need at the development and the capex phase. It'll also give us the returns that we need when we bring fields of this size forward. And the technology to bring floating wind into operation today exists. You know, we as a company have been involved in delivering about 60% of offshore floating structures globally to date. We also work closely with Principal Power. It's a technology, WindFloat, for floating wind, which has been in operation for the past 10 years in many different global situations. So the technology is here, but it needs to be continually optimized, and innovation continues as well. Which brings me to my second point. I think we need to place a much greater emphasis on R&D and innovation in the technologies to drive down that cost point for sustainable energy and offshore floating wind energy as well. If we can actually keep driving with innovation, floating wind is a technology play. It's not a commoditized procurement play. If we can keep driving down with innovation, doing more actually, I should say, with actual less, we'll reach a price point where actually green energy is more cost effective and cost attractive to the consumer than the energy provided by fossil fuels today. And then we'll switch. So I think the emphasis on R&D and innovation, we see many countries globally placing huge, vast amounts of investment and focus into it, and I think it's a really important area for us here in floating wind and its production. And then the third area I wanted to touch on a little bit is about the fact that, you know, floating offshore wind can be delivered locally. And of course then we want to build the industrial strength that accompanies that as well in our local environments. I was at a conference this morning where the leader of the Scottish TUC was talking around the fact that from the fixed bottom wind to date, it's only delivered 2,000 jobs in Scotland. We need to do much better with floating wind. And we've got a really strong supply chain, a really strong, innovative, technology-led supply chain coming from oil and gas, amongst other industries, in Scotland and in the UK. So we need to put the focus on engaging with that supply chain early. Again, at this point, we need a lot of early investment to be able to get the technologies to be developed. So that collaboration between government, private sector, and industry is going to be hugely important to enable the supply chain to get ready in enough time to take advantage of the projects when they reach the capex phase. So I'm really interested in hearing the views of the panel today on those three areas that I've covered, but also their own views on what it will take to make floating wind a success globally and here in the UK. So firstly, let me introduce the panel, and I'll probably move from my left to right. So David, let you introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm David Stevenson. I'm Head of Offshore Wind Policy and Supply Chain within the Scottish Government.
Alexandra?
Okay, I'm Alexandra Bekker. I am the CEO of SINTEF, which is Norway's largest research institute.
Welcome, Alexandra. Dan?
Hi, I'm Dan McGrail. I'm the CEO of Renewable UK, so the biggest trade association covering the wind industry in the UK.
Then we move to another Dan.
Good afternoon, my name is Dan Finch. I'm the Managing Director for Ocean Winds. We're an offshore wind developer based in Europe, but with projects all around the world. I'm responsible for projects in the UK, Ireland and Poland at the moment, and these include fixed and floating projects.
And then Robert.
Afternoon all, my name is Robert Zaproszkiewicz. I'm from the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult, which is a UK research organisation looking into offshore renewables. I look after the floating wind from the engineering perspective.
Super. So a really strong panel. So what I thought I would do actually, just to get us started, was to actually get two of you to answer a question or a couple of questions, and then other people can just come in with their views, and I'll keep moving around that way to make it workable. So I was going to start actually with you, Dan McGrail, and then go to you, Alexandra, to share what opportunities do you believe that offshore floating wind presents in helping the world and individual countries reach our climate goals, and also maybe to add your view on what you think might be easy wins that we can resolve to make large-scale floating wind a reality in the near term. Dan, if I start with you.
Okay, thanks, Sean. I think, first of all, the big opportunity I see is that if you look at the development we've achieved in the UK with fixed bottom, in a little over a decade, we've gone from having a relatively niche technology which has, gone through a process of commercialization to now, in 2021, being very much at the center, the backbone, if you like, of the future energy system. So it's created confidence, it's scaled up, and it's reduced costs dramatically. But if we're honest, one of the key enablers of that has been the fact that the geography around the United Kingdom has enabled that to happen. And even though it's in many respects a statement of the obvious, the big opportunity of floating offshore wind is that any country with a coastline can now engage in offshore wind and engage in that benefit, because that is an important part of the story here in the UK, and particularly in the context of being here at COP, is that we can tell this story of industrial development. Whilst to take your point about 2,000 jobs in Scotland, there are around the UK 26,000 people today working in offshore wind, and this year alone we've seen about $1 billion in private investment in supply chain, factories, long-term jobs being created, and with the potential in the long run for export. So, and by and large, many of those investments have been in communities which have needed it, frankly, and that's part of the just transition story. So, and then I think the other point I'd make in terms of the opportunity, I was listening last night on the BBC to the energy minister from Colombia talking about the impacts and there in particular of mining, and there, let's say, a certain reluctance to move away from coal exports. And I think part of this story is like, how do you then bring this type of technology and the industrial benefits that can be brought with it to countries all over the world, not just in terms of manufacturing turbines, but we know that floating foundations are going to require localization and they're going to require delivery, and that's going to create meaningful jobs in the long run. In terms of the key sort of low-hanging fruit, or the easy wins, as you put it, I think it's that point about scale. I think I think it's a really important point that we say this isn't new technology. Hywind went in 2005. I'm sure you'll talk about it, but this technology has already started to move up the learning curve. So now there's a certain sense, I think, of impatience. We want to go bigger because we know that if we go bigger, we can get the cost down and we can start to bring this technology right into the mainstream.
Totally. Agree.
I'd just like to build on what you're saying. I think there's some huge steps taken. I was there in 2005 when we tested the Hywind model in the ocean basin at SINTEF, and then you made these first big steps, financed a lot by the oil industry. And we've always been targeting the markets that pay the highest price, because you have to build scale. But now there's Norway, for instance, has made a call now for 1.5 gigawatts, and I think scale is extremely important. And I think it has a big promise for the world. I went to China in 2009 and talked to them about floating or offshore wind and floating offshore wind, and they were just totally not interested. And then 10 years later, China is the biggest offshore wind developer. And I think what you're saying, when you get the cost down, this will be a global solution, but where Norway and Scotland have industry structures and knowledge institutions that can bring forward. And to me, it's a balance between scale and mass production, at the same time keeping renewing. There is a long R&D trail ahead, and I think a lot of the cost cuts will come in collaboration in ecosystems around and between the partners, and that's why we are very happy that we've launched one research center and another big collaborative projects with more than 30 parties, where Aker is a part of that, of course. And for example, data sharing for digitalization will be very important. I'm sure many people will talk about that.
No, I agree. I think, and both interesting points. And I think if we build on that, and maybe I'll go to yourself, Dan and Roberts, what is your view then on some of the challenges, as opposed to the opportunities that face the deployment of floating wind? And then I'm probably going to ask all of you about innovation research, but the challenges I think would be interesting to begin with.
For me, the challenges aren't dissimilar to what we've experienced in fixed. In the early days, there was a lot of experimentation, a lot of research and development. Scale wasn't very great, so we tended to do things in small numbers. As a consequence, we struggled then to get local content, because industry wasn't prepared or able to invest in the facilities to mass produce. But as we've got bigger and bigger, but other participants have also mentioned scale. As time went on, we actually became better at the whole process, from site selection through consenting, through development. We were more able to mass produce. We started to see large-scale investment in the UK, and all of this has got to come for floating. And this is one of the criticisms have been, in the past, that You know, some of the fixed projects didn't use enough local content, but it was exceptionally difficult in some cases because the local content wasn't available. You know, there wasn't the scale of investment in facilities. You know, there weren't enough cable suppliers, there weren't enough people in the market because they didn't have the confidence in the market. And this brings me on to the next point about one of the challenges is that you've got to have a high enough target so that there's enough projects coming on stream year after year after year. If you've got a relatively small target, then all you have is boom and bust. You get one project is built, and then there's a 2 or 3 year gap before the next project comes online. And I think this is one of the real positive things about the Scottish process in particular, is the Scottish government has recognised that unlike other markets, they can see that we've gone past some of the very, very early R&D stages, and we're really at the stage now where we need to deploy more at scale if we're going to start driving that cost down. Another challenge is the time that it takes to get from site selection to actual build. You know, at the moment we're talking about a decade. So, you know, if we're going to encourage the inward investment or the investment in facilities, we've got to be very, very proactive in the early years, or else we risk this long drag before we actually start putting money into supply chain. So we've got to see projects coming online frequently. We've got to see the duration for the whole development process being decreased, and we've got to take the lessons that we've learned before and actually deploy these lessons into floating projects.
Yeah, I agree. So it's building on what we've learned and taking it that one step further. So Roberts, what do you think, from your perspective, particularly from an engineering perspective with ORE, what do you see as the challenges currently that are facing floating wind?
I mean, there are numerous, none of them obviously, they're all solvable. We are very kind of fortunate, as Dan said, in the UK, you know, we do have the shallow waters, but even with that, for us to meet our net zero targets, we need floating wind. You know, it's not, you know, do we? No, we have to have floating wind to meet, I think it's 100 gigawatts of offshore wind, roughly 50 we expect will come from floating wind. And obviously that offers us kind of the spatial distribution. We can suddenly start putting floating wind around the UK, which helps us with energy security, which also helps us with our net zero targets in terms of if there is no wind on one coast, we can still run operations on the other coast, so we don't need to switch on whether that's gas or whatever the reserve is. But at the same time, it does bring multiple challenges. Obviously, supply chain, local content, Dan covered that already. I mean, cost will come down. You know, we expect floating wind to be subsidy free by 2030. There are issues with grid, obviously. That's whether you're fixed floating or bottom fixed wind, but you know, government and other organizations are looking already into that, whether that's some kind of a super grid in Europe or whether that's a backbone on the East Coast for the UK. Ports is probably a big one. We're already seeing some motion and some investment coming in, and you know, the government provided, I think it was 160 million, and that basically led to 1 to 10 then kind of additional investment from the private sector. We now recently saw this announcement of 160 million for Scotland and Wales for floating wind specifically. So again, ports need to be developed, but we do have a bit of time, so that's again can be solved. Mass production of substructures, again, I think floating wind will be easier for us to meet the local content targets. You don't want to be bringing in substructures from half away around the world. You want to at least put them together as close to the final site as possible. So supply chain, yes, it needs to see that kind of the pipeline. So we need credible, ambitious targets, as Dan highlighted. I think we could start doing something about collecting environmental data already. So if it does take 7 to 10 years to develop a project, if we collect some of that data already now, analyze it, and then make it available, could we shorten that period to maybe 5 years? I think some intermediate scale projects are needed as well, and you need those so that we can, sprinkle a bit of innovation in those, and that will bring down the cost. Mass production is great, but you need innovation as well. And no one project's just going to put all the innovation in one project, so you need multiple projects so that there's a bit of innovation in all of them, but then together it actually makes one large sum.
Oh, absolutely. No, a really good answer. And I think next I'll move actually to yourself, David. And I think on this one, maybe we'll just switch tack a little bit. And the question I've got for you is, how do you think that floating wind deployment can help to grow the industrial strength that we seek?
Well, from a Scottish perspective, we think it's the next natural step. Obviously, from as panelists have touched on, a lot of the early deployment has been in southern waters, where it's a lot shallower, and therefore the concentration of economic benefits are tended to be round about those locations. As others have touched on, you're not necessarily wanting to take these structures too far from where they're going to be ultimately deployed. So we see this as very much as a next stepping stone, and not obviously replacing oil and gas, because obviously there's still some opportunities out there, but a transition of the knowledge that we've gained from that particular sector over the past 40 odd years, and moving those expertise into the world of floating. But at the same time, as others have touched on, we do want to see the economic benefits that are going around that, the ports and harbours infrastructure. We set out our stall quite early, back in 2015 and so forth, with Hywind Scotland and Kincardine, which is now the world's largest floating offshore wind farm, just off the coast of Aberdeen there. But the economic benefits for both those projects were very low. But we need to see how we can help collectively, both from a government industry perspective, how we can actually start to deliver more of these economic benefits to the communities around our coastline, and for the wider, in our case, for the wider benefit of the Scottish population. So that's the challenge that we have forward. As Dan's alluded to, we've already kind of set our stall out to a certain extent with the ScotWind leasing programme, up to 10 gigawatts of potential offshore wind there. Not all of it will be floating, but just sheer due to the depths around the Scottish coastline. Probably circa 80% of that might be in the favour of floating offshore wind. So we are setting that out, and we are continuing to look at opportunities to build on ScotWind 1 by ScotWind 2, 3, 4 in the years to come, to give both the developer community and the inward investment community the vision that they ask for, that this is something that is here for the long haul. So if they invest now, they will reap the benefits for years to come. So I think we are very much setting our stall out, but it's not going to be easy. We've found that through the fixed process, where not all the benefits come to Scotland, the UK, but we need to ensure through things that we've set in place through the ScotWind process of the supply chain development statement, where we've asked developers to set out the position very early on, and obviously changes now with the contract for different process and the supply chain the supply chain plans, to now really push forward to get more and more of these economic benefits back to, well, Scotland, in our case, the wider UK as a whole.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with you, and I think I think the process, the policy and the regulation is starting to improve that process in the UK, and I think the next step is collaboration across.
Very much so. Government can't do any of this on its own, no matter who you are and where you are around the world. They need everybody to play their equal share in helping out, because there's knowledge across the board, whether it be in regulation or in the actual industrial build out of these items. We need to learn from a lot. We are trying to front load a lot of this by our sectoral marine plan, so that before the developers enter the kind of consenting process, we've already kind of identified where the best locations for deploying offshore wind, floating offshore wind, are going to be in interactions with other users of the sea, because we need to remember them. No guarantee you'll ultimately get planning permission, but hopefully it sets you along the road a wee bit further on, rather than getting any major issues at the far end. We were trying to front load a lot of this as much as we can under the devolved powers that are at our disposal.
No, I agree. And Alexander, from your experience in Norway, is it the same policy and the same process that's been?
Well, obviously, the Norwegian supplier industry that has become so big through the oil industry is looking very much for new opportunities, and see the first licensing round in Norway as a very interesting opportunity to get into position. Although I should say that we have very much also a discussion about energy security, and the opportunity to have enough power to build up onshore industry, such as the battery industry, hydrogen, electrolysis, etc. So it's not just local jobs in supply chain, it's the interconnectivity between supplier industry ashore, electrification of the oil and gas fields, because that's 25% of our CO2 footprint. and the question of connections to the markets around the North Sea, because we have the hydropower, and that's the big debate really, how much should we